Well, it is a wonderful privilege to have Dr. Alec Ryrie on the podcast today. He is professor of the history of Christianity at Durham University and a fellow of the British Academy. He's an expert in the Reformation, on Protestantism, and has written several wonderful books, including one I read a couple years ago that I'd love to discuss at some point called Unbelievers, An Emotional History of Doubt. Today, though, we're talking about his latest book, and that is The Age of Hitler and How We Will Survive It, published by Reaction Books earlier this year, 2025. Dr. Ryrie, thank you so much for coming on the So We Speak podcast.
That's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Godwin's Law, since we will get there pretty quickly in this conversation. But I think it's a good intro into the core observation of the book. Tell us what Godwin's Law is, maybe as an intro into the book.
So, Godwin's Law is, I think it was kind of a joke. And like a lot of jokes that are really on the nose, has kind of long outlived its initial context. So Mike Godwin was an internet pioneer who in 1990 observed that the longer an online discussion goes on, the greater the chance of somebody comparing somebody else to Hitler or to the Nazis. And he later added his corollary, which is that once that happens, the discussion is over. And I mean, I think almost nothing else about the internet is still recognizable 35 years later, but that's still just about true. And I mean, the reason I like this is because I think it crystallizes really clearly just the particular place that references to Hitler and to the Nazis have in our culture, which is that they are the only fixed reference point that we've got. I mean, many of us might individually have other things that we regard as our fundamentals, but in terms of things that we can pretty much depend on in civilized society, that's something that we have collectively accepted as a given. That if somebody compares you to Hitler or to the Nazis, that's not something that you debate about. It's a punch in the face. Right. It's the ultimate insult. It's no accident that that's what brings a discussion to an end, because once you've been called a Nazi, what else can you say? You either leave the thread or say, no, you're the Nazi, and then you're just shouting at each other.
Which
everything
unfortunately
else that we've
happens.
There's you can carry on the argument, but this is a thick black line. It just draws a line underneath it, and that was it wasn't the starting point for it, but I think it helps to make the point that I've tried to make it much more length in the book about the peculiar significance that our memory of World War II and of the Nazis has had over our lifetimes, and why that's both a good thing and a little bit of a problem.
Right. And I think what it does is it provides an experiential touch point for the argument of the book. I've used this book now in two settings, teaching, and quoted a passage I'm about to read to you. And I think Godwin's Law is an interesting thing because it's something almost everyone has experienced. And so when you make the central point of the book, you start to see heads nodding like, oh, yeah, okay, this is giving language to something I have experienced, but I would never have been able to summarize it like this. The central assertion of the book, as I read it, is that Hitler has become the most common or most significant moral figure in our world. And on page 50, you write, a century ago, the most potent moral figure in Western society was Jesus Christ. Now it is Adolf Hitler. Perhaps we still believe that Jesus is good, but not with the same fervor and conviction that we believe Nazism is evil. Crosses and crucifixes have lost most of their power in our culture. It's possible to play with them, joke about them, and no one really minds. Not so with swastikas.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not going to argue with with what you were just reading. I think there's something significant about this. Well, there's just obviously I think there's something significant about it. That's why I read the book. I'm aware that it's provocative to make that comparison between Hitler and Jesus. to say, put it mildly. The point is that while both, I think, have served as the kind of fundamental moral touchstones for Western culture within living memory, they've done it in diametrically opposite ways, or almost diametrically opposite. And so what we have done is swapped out a positive moral exemplar who shows us what good is for a negative one that shows us what evil is. So our moral compasses that used to point towards Jesus now point away from Hitler. And one of the reasons that transition is possible is because actually they end up pointing in a very similar direction. So in some ways, this is a pretty subtle shift. The values that you end up with at the end of the process may not seem that different, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was so easy for us as a culture to make that jump. It didn't feel like you were crossing a chasm. But there are some significant differences. Not so much in the sense that there are particular ethical issues that you would approach differently. There are one or two, but the business of swapping out a positive for a negative exemplar has various knock-ons. It means it's much harder for us to know what to love, what the good is. We know what we hate and what we're against. We're great at the whole hating business. But it would be nice to see a little more of the other side being built up, and the secular moral culture that we've got now that's based around our shared loathing of Nazism doesn't really give us some of the resources for doing that. So I always have to be careful when I talk about this, because when you say swapping out Jesus for Hitler, that sounds like a bad thing. And I do think it is a bad thing, or at least a thing with a lot of problems about it. But my complaint is not that we have demonized Hitler or the Nazis. There are some folks out there who have made a similar point to this before, who've said, actually, Nazis, they're not so bad. We shouldn't be so obsessed by them. That's not my position.
Right.
I think if you're going to pick one human being to stand as a representative of absolute evil, then, I challenge you to come up with a better candidate. I just don't think that's a brilliant idea. I don't think it's a great way of understanding our ethics. Not just because it leaves us with an impoverished sense of what's good. It also leaves us with a weirdly one-dimensional sense of what evil is.
Right.
There are a lot of evils out there that don't wear swastikas on their armbands,
Yes.
and that don't conform to that model.
Right.
And there's a lot of evils out there that are best defeated by means other than waging total war against them.
Yeah, this was a really fascinating point in the book, and I want to come back to the good as we get to the end of the conversation, because I think that's one of the really enduring messages of this book. But in the middle of the book, you trace some of these implications of this swap that's happened, and some of it has to do with the Second World War being essentially our cultural backdrop. It's our Trojan War, you mentioned, or our shared narrative, and because of that, we tend to default with every issue that we face like it's Nazi Germany. And there are geopolitical implications of this. You trace a few of the reactions of the West, towards dictators, peace through strength. I actually thought the most interesting one that you mentioned was the COVID pandemic. When you
Yeah.
when you step back from it in a little bit of hindsight, there's some stunning similarities to the way we treated COVID like it was Nazi Germany, which didn't turn out to be that great a strategy. But talk a little bit about how this backdrop, this swap that's taken place, has actually given us a model to deal with all conflict, whether or not the conflict is in any way similar to the Nazis and Adolf Hitler.
Sure. So, almost one of the first lessons that was drawn from World War II. It's a lesson which is drawn almost before the war has started. Is that the policy of so-called appeasement that Britain and France are following in 1938 was not just a failure, but was a moral disaster. The accusation against the appeasers made in the famous pamphlet "Guilty Men" in 1940 is that the appeasers are guilty, that they're culpable for this. It's not that they have made an honest attempt to preserve the peace and it didn't work out. And that sense of appeasement as a moral failure has really resonated. And you can, I mean, of course, the idea that it makes sense simply not to give way before aggression because bad behavior, rewarding bad behavior encourages it. I mean, that's a good common sense principle. But if I think about how you deal with kids' bad behavior, there are more responses and more creative responses than just escalating to ever greater punishments. Mm-hmm. In terms of distraction or finding more constructive solutions, or sometimes listening because occasionally they have a point, finding other ways through. Now, international affairs are different. I get that. Even so, if you look at our track record of trying to apply that blanket prohibition against appeasement, which not even Winston Churchill thought should be used as a general principle in the way that we have done. We have a series of examples from the Suez Crisis in '56 to, I mean, maybe most obviously and disastrously, the Second Iraq War in 2003, which is set about with the language of anti-appeasement. President Bush explicitly justifies that invasion on the basis of avoiding the example that was set by those confronting the dictators in the 30s. Though, I mean, the model really doesn't fit, and I don't think you can look back on the history of the Iraq War and say that was a successful example of deterring anyone from anything, apart from maybe the Western powers from getting engaged in something like this again. And then you look at the way this language is used during the Cold War. I quote in the book, there's an exchange that took place in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where one of the, I believe it's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is saying, no, as a matter of moral obligation, if Berlin were to fall, we would have to launch an all-out nuclear strike, because that's what you have to do to maintain this principle of anti-appeasement. And I do think that if your moral structure is such that as a matter of moral principle you need to destroy the world, then your moral principles could maybe do with a bit of fine-tuning.
Right. Well, as a father of three, under three, while it does seem like World War II a lot of the time, that there are more creative ways to deal with problems, and taking this kind of one tool if all you have is a hammer kind of approach. You're right. Historically, has not turned out with the same effects that the heroic story is told about World War II did. It's interesting to me too, as a historian. I'd love your thought. Is there a dotted line, at least, between some of the revulsion to taking the approach that we have, in whether it be the Cold War or the war in Iraq, to one on the right, the pushback on the neocon movement has largely been with the backdrop of Iraq. So that kind of conservative foreign policy is now not in favor among Republicans, partly because I think, whether it's for the same reason you're talking about or not, that was not a good way about going about solving that crisis. On the flip side, I think another grandchild of this phenomenon is you have statues of Churchill being desecrated in London and all over the world. We have this kind of revisionist, we've got to get back to what the motives were. Were these people really all that good? Were they racist? Were they all these things? That seems to have some connection to this as well. Do you think there's a pushback or a pendulum swing against this treat everything like World War II philosophy? Or do you see a different thread running through these issues?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really interesting phenomenon, which, I mean, to some extent, it's just, I mean, I have never managed to get too excited about the statue wars, just because I'm sufficient of an old Calvinist to be wary of putting anyone or anything on a pedestal. And you know, human beings are messy, and if you try to turn anyone into a hero, you're going to find out that there's a more complicated story than that.
Yes.
But I do think it's interesting the way that World War II based ethic has started to eat itself. And you can see how, you know, essentially it is that anti-Nazi set of principles, or a kind of descendant or mutant version of them, which is now being turned against the people who were once the heroes of that story.
Right.
And you know, I mean, it's true. Churchill had some pretty pungent racial views, and he said a lot of really ill-advised things over the course of a very long career.
Right.
So you know, you can absolutely make a case that he as a hero is yeah, has got something wanting about him. But what I think is significant about that development is not just that we're trying to be more historically complicated about stuff, but that the simplistic moral message that I think when I was a kid we used to take from the World War II story, that you know, we especially, you know, we in Britain and America, I think especially regard ourselves as the good guys of that war. We were the heroes in our slightly different ways. You know, different national myths there. And then that shifted in various ways, and it's now kind of breaking down. It's very obviously breaking down on the right, where you can see the taboos against anything that's redolent of fascism in much of Europe, not only in Europe, have been breaking. But I think there's a comparable shift on the left as well, where the Nazi genocide no longer feels like the central, the reference case. It's simply one example, and maybe not the most central example,
Right.
in a
Yeah.
kind of rogues gallery of racists and imperialists running through from the the colonial era, the slave trade, and coming very much up to the present. And you can see in the Gaza war the way that Israel has been rolled into that narrative too.
Yeah, this is a topic that is only getting more pertinent since your book came out, especially events of the last week or two, is the topic of anti-Semitism and what role this plays in, you know, quote, the age of Hitler, in the moral framework that you're describing. So I have an observation here that I want to run past you and see if it jives with your book. I think one of the things that you point out is the way that we've talked about the Nazis has changed over time. There's a lot of things to select if you're looking for things that the Nazis did wrong. The one that we tend to talk about now is that they were racists. You know, they were anti-Semitic, they committed a genocide, and of course, that has been something, like you just mentioned, that people are looking for all over the place, whether it be in history or today. That is a very hot issue in our culture. At the same time, and here's the theory, part of the crumbling of the age of Hitler is if every little, whether it be a microaggression or whether it be, you know, somebody in the past, however we classify it, if every little racial insensitivity amounts to calling somebody a Nazi, racism, anti-Semitism, it in some ways it diminishes the term. And I wonder if this is one of the reasons that the age of Hitler is not quite, the moral framework of the age of Hitler is not quite strong enough to provide a moral framework for a whole culture, is by calling everybody racist for the last, let's say, 10 years, it's given rise to real racism in a way that actually was more on the fringes 10 years ago than it was today. It almost gives a pass. It's when you hear it nonstop, it loses its meaning. And now, like I said, even this week, we've got this controversy over Tucker Carlson, having Nick Fuentes on his podcast, who, is absolutely fringe in so many ways and abhorrent morally, but that's entered back into the conversation. Is this a sign of a crack in the age of Hitler morality? What do you attribute to the rise of anti-Semitism, both on the left and on the right in the last couple of years? And of course, from here, I want to talk about what you think we should do about it.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm really unsure about the cause and effect here. Is it, is the reason why we've had this resurgence of, as you say, serious, almost unabashed racism, the fact that the accusation has become so common, or is the accusation common because the two are
It's a difficult problem.
Yeah. I mean, this phenomenon of the Nazi label being overused is one that goes back, at least to the 60s, when the 60s radicals would, basically call anybody who looked suspiciously over the age of 30 a fascist. And, for a long time, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance have been criticizing what they see as the trivialization of the Holocaust by the overuse of the Nazi label in places where it's not applicable. And I see that point, but I think they're fighting a losing battle when you've got a reference point for evil that has this kind of absolute quality to it. It's just too useful to be let go. But whatever the cause and effect is, the wheels are clearly coming off this, and with a kind of grimly ironic, sickening inevitability, the resurgence of anti-Semitism on both the left and the right in different forms, but sometimes not that different, is the most obvious, the most predictable sign of this. This is a phenomenon that has been out there in Western culture in its different forms for many centuries. The readiness within our culture to, when in doubt, find a reason to blame the Jews for whatever it is you want to blame people for. It's just there. I think when I was a child, we kind of imagined that we might have laid that one to rest. It looks like we were wrong. It's just going to be an ongoing endemic problem and is going to cause ongoing endemic suffering. So it's the most obvious sign that this is coming to an end. But I think we see the signs of it all over the place. And while my immediate response to that is one of kind of fear and rejection, and say, these were the moral certainties that I've been brought up with. As I say, I'm very happy with most of the moral lessons that we've drawn from that period. I also want, when I kind of stand back and let myself calm down for a second, to recognize that, as I've been saying, there are actually some pretty serious problems with defining our shared ethics solely around, or principally around, the memory of World War II. And so moving on from that in itself actually seems to me like a good thing. We are at a, we have been asking the memory of World War II to bear more weight than it's capable of doing. It seems to me we're at a point of flux in our shared values, where conversations that we thought had been settled have been reopened. Things that we thought were agreed on are now up for grabs. And my response to this, in a kind of pretty unfashionable way, is to be optimistic about it. I think there's real scope for us to hold on to the best of what we learned. I mean, learned at terrible cost from the experience of World War II, but then to bring that into dialogue and underpin it more seriously with some of our deeper traditional values. Because I'm a Christian in Western culture, I'm talking principally about Christianity, but I need to emphasize I'm not talking exclusively about that, but about bringing in other more deeply rooted, more supple religious philosophical systems, the things that can show us something worth loving as well as what to hate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think another topic, and I've just encouraged people to read the book and, flesh this out on their own, but another topic that doesn't have quite the same pointed edge on it, but might actually have bigger consequences for the future of our culture is human rights. The construct of human rights are under assault again on kind of both sides of the political spectrum, and part of that is the incapacity, the inability of the Age of Hitler ethic to guarantee things like that in a way that a religious tradition really can. And that goes back to the very founding of America. I appreciated that section as well. I want to ask you about something. I was looking up the origins of the book. I'm always interested in how people get the idea and flesh it out. And I saw that some of these ideas, or at least the outline, started in the Bampton Lectures at Oxford in 2022. But the title there was The Age of Hitler and How We Can Escape It. Your book's subtitle, as we turn, to the last portion of this, is kind of what do we do? Your book's subtitle now is The Age of Hitler and How We Will Survive It. I don't want to read too much in here, but was there an intentional shift there? Is there a note of pessimism as time goes on?
I think that was mostly a change for clarification. I just found that the how we will escape it thing was confusing people.
Mm-hmm.
The point of the title is to be a little bit disorientating. When you see The Age of Hitler, you think, okay, this is a book about the 1930s and 40s. Putting that in the present and future tense is a way of saying, no, the Age of Hitler is what we have been living through, and whose death throes I think we are now in. So yeah, maybe escape isn't right, because it's not a question of that we have to get out of it. We're being left behind by its disappearance. Survive. Yeah, I mean, I said I was being optimistic. That's about the level of optimism that I've got here.
Well, I did sense there's some inevitability there.
I do think that we will reach the kind of synthesis that I'm talking about, which draws on both the hard lessons of the 20th century and the deeper resources that we have in Christianity and in other traditions. But the reason I think we'll get there is a kind of last man standing argument. Mm-hmm. That in the end, I think this is almost the only possible solution. And it reminds me, if you'll forgive a Brit quoting this to an American, of Winston Churchill's line about the United States, which is that it can always be relied on to do the right thing once it's exhausted all the other alternatives.
Yeah, that's a great quote.
And I'd like to think that that's still true, not only of the United States but of all of us. So I do think we will reach a better point in terms of our shared values that's got a more serious underpinning and has got some real resources to draw on to build the good. The question is how much damage gets done on the way, and indeed whether anybody's going to be left to get there by the end.
Yes. Well, yeah, and I thought I say that a little tongue-in-cheek because I think part of the conclusion is, look, this is inescapable. We're in it. We've got to figure out what to do. Part of the thing that was so intriguing to me about the book is at the very end, you have these two letters, and it strikes me as a way of painting the picture, not just from a content perspective on what should happen, and I think that the content is really interesting, but almost as modeling what you think should happen, which is engagement, good faith dialogue, reaching out and seeing the best in what the other perspective is and trying to come to a new consensus. I thought that was actually modeled very well in the book, trying to think, I'm probably in one of those categories more than the other. And I think probably everybody that reads the book is. But as I was reading both of them, I could see, okay, I think somebody who genuinely is in this group, whether it be the progressive secularist or the conservative traditionalist, is going to be seen, is going to see these letters as reaching out in good faith and on their own terms. So I wanted to ask you about both of these as a way of thinking about this question: how do we recover a vision of the good? I think that's the worst thing about the Age of Hitler ethic, is when you swap out a vision of the good for evil that you want to avoid, it does impoverish your moral system. And, we need to recover a common sense of the good as a culture in order to stay coherent. The first one you write is the progressive secularist, and you encourage engagement with older religious traditions. We've seen notable people, even Richard Dawkins, who's been a lightning rod for 25 years now in these debates, migrating towards cultural Christianity. He gives an interview before Easter last year saying, "I'm a cultural Christian. I value all the things that we have in this Christian culture." Do you think this is a net good? Is this a vision of what you're hoping for on progressive secularism, dialoguing, seeing the good, seeing some of the advantages to people of religious faith and tradition?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I maybe should feel more ambiguous or nuanced about this kind of thing. I think it's great. I think that sense of engaging deeply with a tradition, of recognizing that you come from somewhere, whoever you are, wherever it is that you come from, which doesn't mean that you need to swallow that tradition whole or any one part of it. The point of these traditions, and I mean this is as true of, maybe more true of Christianity than of any of the others, is that they're incredibly plural, varied, deep. You can find your way through it. If one person tries to tell you that they have the only and the definitive version of it, then I suggest you watch something else on YouTube. They don't belong to any one person. I would, my Protestant self again, I would even want to say they don't belong to any one institution. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that means that I agree with Dawkins about everything. He's a fantastic writer. But I'm really pleased to have him as part of the conversation in that sense. And that feels to me like quite a constructive moment of recognizing that instead of arguing about metaphysics the whole time, which is what he's mostly seemed to want to do, we're actually going to move on to questions about how you live, which actually seem to me to be much closer to what Christianity is about. There's a lot more about that in the Gospels than there is about metaphysics.
Right. I think I'll go maybe a little bit further than you do in the book. I don't want to speak for you, but as a pastor, I think one of the really big opportunities in terms of engaging people with a progressive or a secularist worldview right now is shifting from the question, is it true, which we've been from an apologetic standpoint, we've been beating that drum now for 2 generations, trying to prove to people that it's true. I tend to think now the better opportunity is to show them that it is good. It's a good vision of the world. There are praiseworthy things. There's things that you love here. And through that, you can connect back to the tradition.
I would, add to that, without wishing to go all Plato on you, the other dimension. Okay, true, fine, good, yes, but also beautiful.
Absolutely. I think this is the next question we need to be asking is, back to the moral compass thing. I think as a culture, we're much more confident in things that are ugly than we are in things that are beautiful. So, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Our appreciation of beauty is subjective, but we're pretty good at figuring out what we think is ugly or undesirable in a culture. And that is an impoverishment. I think getting back to a vision, which Christians have, of what is beautiful and what is good, is one of those possible common ground points for constructive dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah, and recognizing that beauty is not simple or straightforward, but that doesn't mean it's imaginary either.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll end on this point with what I thought was maybe the most compelling paragraph in the book. It's right at the very end. It's in your letter to the conservative traditionalist. You write, this is giving advice to this group. Is crucially, while not compromising on your moral sticking points, do not let secularists and progressives define you by them. Your tradition has far, far more to it than thou shalt nots. You do not need to browbeat people. You can seduce them. What a great line. Your tradition has depth, flourishing, satisfaction, clarity, peace, and joy. The problem with post-Nazi values is not that they're wrong, but that they are insufficient, thin, gray, gruel compared to the taste and richness of your rooted traditions. It's a culture that only knows what it hates. You can show them something worth loving, can't you? That is great writing.
I mean, you're the pastor, but it seems to me this is a task of preaching.
Absolutely is, and a task of living. I think if this were the goal, we would see bridges being built much more quickly than some of the other strategies we've taken. And in a world where the age of Hitler morality is prevalent and cracking, this does seem to me, and I'll give you the final word on this, this does seem to me a very, very good approach for Christians to take.
Well, I'm pleased that you think so. I've found my unfashionable optimism just a little bit reinforced over the last couple of years, which may just be because I've been having a lot of agreeable conversations. But it seems to me there's a bit more of actual dialogue and people making the effort to get out of their bubbles and listen to and engage with each other on a human level going on than was the case a couple of years ago. And, actual human beings talking to, listening to, trying to understand other human beings. That seems to me the way that we get ourselves out of this mess.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Alec Ryrie, thanks for your wonderful book, The Age of Hitler and How We Will Survive It, and thanks for coming on the So We Speak podcast.
That's a great pleasure. Thank you.